Hello, good evening to everyone. I'm Dr. Philip McMillan, and I have been talking about COVID and COVID related issues since 2020. One of the things that I've had the tremendous pleasure and honor is interviewing experts from across the world. I've managed to be the first to interview Gert. I've managed to be the first to interview Robert Malone, Dr. Shankara Shetty, all of these people. And I have learned so much, not just from the interview, but also the discussions before and after. One of the people that I'll be introducing to you now, I've spoken to on many occasions. And so I respect her opinion very highly. And one thing is for certain, she pulls no punches. She tells it as it is, and she is not afraid of rocking the boat. So, without further ado, I'll introduce to you Jennifer Smith. Hi, Jennifer. Can you just introduce yourself to the audience?
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks so much for having me back, Philip. It's always exciting and fun to chat with you, and really happy to share some of this information with everyone today.
And
My background is that I have a PhD in microbiology and molecular cell sciences with subject matter expertise in respiratory viruses. I've spent a majority of my career in vaccine development and preclinical testing, mainly with respiratory viruses. More recently, I worked as an epidemiologist at the Hawaii Department of Health, where I served on the front lines of the pandemic in the Disease Outbreak Control Division, doing case investigation and contact tracing. That's where I blew the whistle on the misinformation and corruption that I witnessed firsthand and was subsequently discharged from my position for contradicting the narrative.
wow. So, listen, that's important, Jennifer, because you are not afraid to call stuff out. And so, this should be an interesting discussion. But let me just clarify because what will happen is that people will immediately start to try and discredit you when you say anything outside of the narrative. So, just to be clear, when you were doing your work and so on, were you involved in vaccine development and so on? And what was your kind of position when it comes to that?
Right. So, a majority of the work that I did following my master's degree was in vaccine development, specifically with respiratory viruses, influenza. So, I was part of the team that made the first H5N1 avian virus for use in humans. So, I helped test that virus in animal or that vaccine in animal models. We also tested and developed a H5N1 avian influenza vaccine for use in poultry. And that was actually pushed out into Southeast Asia during the H5N1 outbreak in 2003 and 2004. The human vaccine was actually stockpiled for use with BARDA. I also collaborated with the Centers for Disease Control, looking at the development of small droplet aerosol vaccination for mass vaccination campaigns for flu. I've managed a government contract to test candidate vaccines for Ebola or hemorrhagic fever viruses. So I, again, spent majority of my career working in vaccine development and preclinical testing.
And so, if you say anything that challenges that narrative, Jennifer, does it make you feel uncomfortable that if you challenge that narrative, you are almost putting the reputation of scientists around you at risk by doing that? And remember, a lot of scientists are very sensitive now, especially after the shooting that happened at the CDC. They believe that people should pull together as one, hold the line, don't dismantle the narrative. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I'm not afraid to call things out. In fact, that's part of our training as scientists is we have to question, we have to have those discussions, play devil's advocates, criticize. I mean, we're basically raised on criticism. So being critical, asking questions. I was told by my PI when I was in my training for my doctorate was, pick something that's a central dogma and question it and do research to see if it's actually still relevant. He said that was probably like the one of the key things that we should be doing as scientists. So no, I don't have a problem with calling things out. And I've been maligned by both sides. I've been maligned by the people who bought the whole COVID narrative lock, stock, and barrel. I've been maligned by the virus deniers. What I stand on is the data.
Yeah, that's very, very important. So, I mean, we are going to be talking quite soon about this very interesting article that you have here about the great, safe, and effective, a great marketing slogan, but not rooted in science. And it is an important question about what is safe, what is toxic, and so on. But before we do that, I'm really curious as to your thoughts about the recent change with regards to varicella vaccination in the UK. What's the background? What's the issue? Because they didn't do it before. What happened here?
So it's really interesting. I just had this discussion yesterday with a group about the chickenpox vaccine here in the US. And somebody sent me the article that they're now actually going to be recommending it for use in the UK, which I found quite stunning, because one of the things I actually said was that most European countries don't actually recommend chickenpox vaccine for use. And the chickenpox vaccine was actually implemented for use in the US in 1995. And while we saw a decrease in the incidence of chickenpox cases, there was actually over a 90% decrease in varicella incidence and severe outcomes here in the US. The issue then becomes, we've basically just shifted the burden of disease from children, who it's mostly a mild, common childhood illness in children that lasts about a week. And now all we've done is shifted the burden of disease into older people or adults with shingles, which is actually more serious in the adult population. So what happens is children get chickenpox, they recover in about a week. With those people who then have recovered, they get this booster effect by being re-exposed to other children who have chickenpox, right? So even as adults, when we're exposed to children who had chickenpox, that helps to boost our own immunity, keeping the virus in check and helping to prevent reactivation and shingles. So because children are no longer getting chickenpox here, we've seen an increase in shingles cases in adults.
Wow. So this is a very important point, and it's one of those non-specific effects that I've heard Professor Christine Stabel-Ben talk about, non-specific effects of vaccines that you have to take into consideration when you are looking at population impacts. So that's critical information to grasp. So when
right, it's unfortunate because that's actually the reason, that's actually the rationale that European countries were not recommending the chickenpox vaccine, was because it was actually predicted by the medical community that would happen. And so that's why most European countries like the UK were not recommending chickenpox vaccine. So it's quite stunning that they would make a reversal on that decision and now start recommending it, because as we know, shingles can be more serious and more severe in adults. And that's why, now we have the shingles vaccine.
Yeah, and so therefore, when you think about it, do you think that that action was in support of the anti-RFK movement, so to speak? Because there's a lot of stuff happening with regards to the CDC, HSS, what's going on in the background. Is this more political than it is necessarily scientific?
I'm not really certain the rationale for it. That's what's so surprising. I haven't really dug much into it, but reading the article, what they're going to be using is a combination vaccine with MMR. So it's MMR varicella vaccine, and I think the biggest issue that I see with this is, what people need to know is that it's a live attenuated virus vaccine. So all the viruses, all 4 of those viruses are actually live viruses. And, I just pulled up the package inserts. ProQuad is the vaccine. And I just pulled up the package insert. And the very, very first thing it says on the package insert under adverse reactions is significant or systemic vaccine related adverse events reported at significantly higher rate in recipients is measles like rash and chickenpox like rash. So people really need to be aware that because it's a live virus vaccine, the virus can revert to virulence and cause the actual disease that you're trying to prevent. So the issue I have is we don't normally type these vaccines. So a child gets measles, like we had a measles outbreak recently in Texas. They're not typing those viruses routinely to see if it's a wild type strain versus a vaccine derived strain. So we don't actually know the incidence of chickenpox or measles that are actually from the vaccines.
There's an important point here that you've raised, and as I reflect carefully on the issue about the reactivation and the risks, public health normally almost takes a parental view of the population, where they just tell them what to do, and you need to trust the science. Are you giving too much information to a public that doesn't get the science and so therefore could make the wrong decisions?
No, I think that's actually to assume that the public is too stupid to understand is actually very, very damaging to, developing trust with these public health professionals. People are smarter than you think. There are a lot of people out there who are aware and who have been aware for a very long time. And so it's time, this information is widely available. This is, like I said, it's in the package insert. It's put out there by the manufacturer. It's put out there by CDC. It's not anything that I'm making up. It's all their information and their data from their trials.
Yeah, it's very important. And so therefore, as we come into this question, because at the moment, as I said, there is a huge amount of concern with regards to the fact that the public is losing faith in vaccines. And I liken that to what has happened in COVID. Anything that rocks that boat can make it worse. Are you making it worse?
Well, we've had this discussion over the last few years, Philip, and you know that this whole vaccine movement has really become a religion. And, God forbid we question the great, the great golden goose, right? So, again, it's based on facts. I'm not calling out anything that isn't publicly available. This is all from the CDC. It's all from the FDA. It's all from the manufacturer themselves. It's now just the veil has been lifted and eyes are being opened to the truth. And, we need to be able to make our own decisions about what we put into our bodies.
Some people would argue that you were part of the institution that was driving vaccines in the first place, and therefore, how can they trust what you are saying now? And in a sense, what is your overall view then with regards to how the childhood vaccine schedule is going?
So, it's really interesting. I did work in vaccine development, and I've largely ignored childhood vaccines because I didn't need to get them, and I don't have children, so I didn't have anyone in my household who would need to get them. So I largely didn't pay attention to childhood vaccines. And when I started getting questions and I was like, okay, let me look into this, let me start digging into this a little bit more and reading more about it, I was surprised. I was really surprised by what I found. And, I'm willing to educate myself. I'm willing to look at the information. I'm willing to educate myself. And, a lot of things that I found, I was stunned. And I thought, if I was in the field and I wasn't aware of these things, I'm sure there are a lot of people out there who are not aware. We talk about the medical profession, the doctors and nurses, they're not educated about vaccines. the information they get in medical school is here's the schedule, here's what to give if there's a bad reaction, and that's it. They don't learn about vaccinology and the technologies and the platforms, and they don't learn about vaccinal immunity, and they don't learn about the other components that are in vaccines. And so, as somebody who worked in the field, who did those studies and developed those vaccines, who better has the knowledge in vaccinology?
Yeah. So these are important points. And I think that this is the challenge now. I think I'm encouraging people, even though people will criticize the point of people doing their own research. That got RFK into quite a lot of trouble. But I do think that in the context of the capability that people have through artificial intelligence and what is on the internet, people can actually get a pretty good idea about risk-benefit decisions, and they fundamentally have to take responsibility, because one of the things that has come out of the COVID pandemic is that if there are issues, you are responsible. Nobody else will take accountability for that.
Right.
And that seems to be the general trajectory that things are going on.
The thing is, this is not about rejecting vaccines. This is not about being anti-vaccine or anti-anything. This is about being pro. It's being pro-informed consent. It's about being pro-information. So this is not anti, and it's not about rejecting vaccines.
Excellent. So when we look at this article that you did on your Smith's Virology blog, if anybody is looking for it, what exactly are you talking about here? This safe and effective marketing slogan, not rooted in science. What made you write this?
The one thing that's been bothering me the last 5 years is this whole mantra of safe and effective, safe and effective. Just take it, it's safe. And it bothered me because safe is not a scientific word. We don't use safe when we talk about, a virus. We talk about the risk. And the real word that should be using, like I said, it makes a great marketing slogan. It's real snappy, but the word that we should really be looking at is toxicity. And I know toxic or non-toxic and effective doesn't make a great marketing slogan, but that's the truth. And toxicity is not binary. Things are not just toxic or non-toxic. Toxicity is on a spectrum, and what may be toxic for you may not be toxic for me. And what may be seriously toxic for somebody else may cause no problem in others. So the thing is, we really need to start looking at toxicity and understanding the toxic effects of all of these things and who is most at risk for those toxic events.
So when you mention toxicity, a scientist would then say to you, toxicity is more in relation to, say, a drug and a dose of a drug. How do you get that question in the context of a vaccine, which seems to be a completely different kind of technology?
That's not true. Toxicity refers to actually any substance that's taken into our body. Anything, even water, can be toxic. So, when we think about things, water, oxygen, any substance that's taken into the body, whether ingested, inhaled, injected, any of those things can be toxic.
And so, but even say, for instance, they would argue, say, when we look at vaccine, say a COVID vaccine, it's giving lipid nanoparticles. They are supposed to be small amount of modified RNA, which then gets destroyed. It's a fraction, tiny amount. It could be argued that that can't really be toxic. Now, listen, important for my listeners. This is not my opinion. I'm just asking questions here to challenge Jennifer that I know other people would challenge her on. So I'm just making it clear. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Well, certainly every vaccine there's risk with every single vaccine. There are 26 different vaccines that contain formalin, which is a known carcinogen. There are 24 vaccines that contain aluminum, which is a known neurotoxin. So every vaccine contains both active and inactive ingredients. And injecting saline may not be a problem, but injecting aluminum, that's another issue. So like everything, we need to look at all the ingredients and all the toxic effects of each of the ingredients. And then of course we have what's the compound effects of each of those things. So, if we look at the childhood schedule, one of the biggest complaints, and actually we can talk about, there's a lawsuit now against the CDC for the childhood vaccination schedule, because if we look at the compound effects, there are actually, and I actually looked this up or tried to look this up, there are no studies, no published peer-reviewed studies on the compound effects of vaccines. We're giving children at 2, 4, 6 months of age, sometimes 6 different injections, which contain up to 25 different antigens, including all the other ingredients such as aluminum and formalin and aborted fetal cells and all of those things. So it may not seem like a risk, but we also, and then you add in the environmental exposures, there's going to be a compound effect for sure.
Somebody once said to me, vaccines are so safe that you could give 100 of them to a child and it would not be a problem. That
is arrogant, and it's complete misinformation. Again, they're completely ignoring the fact that every single thing you put in your body has a level of toxicity. Everything.
One of the questions, especially that you've mentioned aluminum, here's an interesting thought that I had. I have these strange thoughts sometimes when I wake up in the morning. But the question was, the purpose of aluminum in a vaccine is to be an adjuvant, meaning that if you injected that vaccine without aluminum or without an adjuvant, the impact would be very short-lived.
Yes.
And so the adjuvant keeps the immune system stimulated. Okay. Mm-hmm. So the thought I wondered about was, if it works for the vaccine, if there is any other inflammatory process, would the aluminum augment that as well?
Yes, of course. Of course. I mean, that's the point of an adjuvant, right? Because most of these things, most of the antigens that are used, you probably wouldn't mount a very effective immune response against them, especially when you're using a recombinant in a recombinant vaccine or a conjugate vaccine, right? So you're just taking the part of the virus or pathogen that is antigenic or meant to stimulate immune response. But because it's not in the context of the whole pathogen, you probably wouldn't really get any measurable protective immunity from that. So we add adjuvants, and it's really interesting because there's not a lot of information on how aluminum actually works. They think that, of course, it causes inflammation, right? What is inflammation? That's the immune response. When you bring in the immune cells and they start producing cytokines and things, which then recruit other cells. And that helps, like, say, hey, this is a foreign thing here. We need to protect this person from this. And, it acts by damaging cells. So that brings in all the immune cells to then mount an immune response. So, of course, inflammation in the body, that's what most disease is. Inflammation in the body, diabetes, heart disease, it's all inflammation. That's what disease actually is.
So a lot of people would argue, and I've been in conversations recently where people keep on saying that the vaccines that have been used have saved so many millions of lives, and we're thinking of things like smallpox and so on, and the huge scientific progress that occurred with regards to vaccines. We can't afford to throw that away because a few people just don't understand the science. Are they right?
You want me to go down that rabbit hole? Again, the more I dive into this, the more I dig into it, it's very interesting. And my question always is, how do you prove how many people you saved? There's no way, scientific way to prove you saved this many people. I mean, I don't know what they base that on. Modeling studies, which are just not real world applicable, in my opinion. when you look back in history, right? So I did a deep dive into DTaP and tetanus, and the thing is, when we looked at tetanus, and tetanus comes mainly from the soil, it comes from animal feces, and back when horses used to be the main route of mode of transportation, tetanus cases were really high because there was feces everywhere from the horses all walking around, and once the cars started being introduced and horses were moved out of cities, and we saw a decline in tetanus cases because the horses and the manure and all that was no longer prevalent in those populated areas. So when we look at changes in sanitation and living conditions, we saw a steep decline in a lot of these diseases even before vaccines were developed.
Now, what you're saying there may fit in the kind of real world situation, because remember, I do remember when there was the great push with regards to the COVID vaccines, and there was the perspective that if people didn't get them, they were all going to die. And, the unvaccinated, they were going to build huge graveyards for them. And then they didn't take it, and then they didn't die. And suddenly, that alone changed that narrative. You're not suggesting that if, for whatever reason, people then stop taking some of these vaccines, that would it damage that narrative if everything is fine going forward?
What I think we need to do is reassess. Okay, so what we need to do is reassess. What I proposed is, and what I've always said is, it should be based on risk versus benefit. What is the risk from the disease? Okay, who is at risk? Is it mild? Is it severe? Is it fatal? If so, who's at risk for fatalities? If you start looking at the fatality rate from a lot of these things has greatly diminished. Okay, so does it really make sense to continue to use these vaccines? Maybe some of them are just no longer needed because we've reduced, or they talk about eradicating smallpox. We don't give smallpox vaccine anymore. So is it really necessary if we look at the prevalence of the disease and who's at risk, and are there treatments available? We had this discussion again yesterday with the group about tetanus, and why are you giving a tetanus shot if somebody's been exposed? Why not give TIG or tetanus immunoglobulin? There's a therapy and it's very effective. So we need to start asking these questions and then weigh the risk of the disease against the risk and benefits of a vaccine. So again, I personally don't think that everybody needs a vaccine for everything. I actually heard that the WHO wants 500 new vaccines by 2030. And I'm like, what diseases are they wanting to vaccinate against? It's actually helpful. Our immune system's like a muscle. If you think about it like a muscle, you go to the gym, you do your bicep curls, your biceps get stronger, you can lift heavier things. Our immune system needs to be getting that workout. It needs to get exposure. It needs to help build that immune muscle so that when we do see things that we don't commonly see, we're ready to attack and ready to handle those things. So we need those exposures. And, this is going to be controversial. Just warning, do we even need a flu shot every year? These highly mutable RNA viruses that we see routinely, we see them all the time. We're exposed all the time. That's like installing new antivirus software on your computer. You're just updating the antivirus software of your immune system. And it actually is, again, naturally acquired immunity is always, hands down, always going to be more robust and durable than artificially acquired immunity.
Interesting. Here is a point that somebody made. What are your thoughts? The BCG inoculation appears to be the only worthwhile vaccine.
Unfortunately, I'm not very knowledgeable about the BCG vaccine. We don't use that here in the US. I do recall at the beginning of the pandemic, there was some suspicion that the BCG actually offered somehow, we don't understand the mechanism, but it did afford some protection against SARS and severe disease from SARS infection. So unfortunately, I can't give more information on that.
Okay, now here is a point in your article the relevant toxicity of a chemical, looking at toxicity classes. What are you making reference to here?
Okay, so when we talk about toxicity, there are ways that we can measure the toxic effects of chemicals. And one of the ways that we do this is looking at the lethal dose 50. So it's the amount of the chemical that produces or induces 50% death in those that are exposed to it. So this is just some examples of chemicals and their LD50s.
Okay. And so how does that tie in to the vaccine then?
Well, again, as I mentioned, that all vaccines have both active and inactive components. And so you can look at all of those different components and look at the toxicity or LD50 of each of those components to determine the toxicity, the possible toxicity of a vaccine.
Again, they would argue that the doses are so small in terms of their use that it's so tiny that it couldn't possibly cause any significant effects. And actually, they would go further than that. A lot of the scientific community is saying that even some of the things that you call adverse events could just be purely coincidental and not necessarily related to the vaccine, even if it occurred temporarily within a close time frame to the vaccine.
They can say that all they want, but show me the data. Show me the data. You know, look at botulinum toxin. Very small amount, super toxic. You know, we can talk about viruses, virus infection, norovirus takes just a few virus particles to make a lot of people sick. So, you know, we have to look at each thing individually and determine. And again, you know, an infant, we think of an infant still just a small human. No, infants are different than adults. You know, males different from females. You know, we have different hormones. We have different. So everybody, there's differences by age, by health status, by gender. You know, you can't just say that across the board that, oh, it's not toxic, even in small doses. You have no idea. I could drink 2 cups of water and start having a problem. You could drink 2 gallons and never have any problem. You know, water itself can be toxic. So
the argument could then be is that there are so many variables brought in that it would mean that you couldn't give any vaccines because you'd never really know who was going to have an adverse reaction to it. Isn't general safety in terms of numbers, if you have 1 in a million having a negative response, isn't that reasonable? Isn't that a reasonable kind of risk-benefit ratio?
Again, this is about pro-information and pro-informed consent. So what we need to do is give people that information. Give them that information and let them make that decision for themselves. It's all about acceptable risk. You know, like there are people out there who like jumping out of perfectly good airplanes with just for fun. I'm not signing up for that. There are people out there who like to ride on motorcycles without helmets. I won't get in a vehicle without doors. You know, so it's all about acceptable risk. What somebody may think is not an issue is just another day of fun for them. Other people are like, no way I'm touching that. So, you know, we have to give that information and let people make those decisions for themselves.
When we look at this here, when you looked at the components and the risks that were associated, looking at adjuvants, preservatives, residuals, stabilizers, all of these pieces, are you suggesting that they are tested separately, or is this what you are looking for at the combination?
So one of the things that we really need to know about in terms of for informed consent is we should know what type of vaccine we're getting. Is it live attenuated? Is it whole killed? Is it a conjugate vaccine? Is it a genetic vaccine? And then what are the ingredients? What ingredients are in this vaccine? Are there preservatives? You know, RFK Jr., the Secretary of Health and Human Services, just announced that they're removing thimerosal preservative from all flu shots. So thimerosal, which is a mercury-based. So, you know, we need to know what are the ingredients. There are a lot of people who are now, with the whole exemptions and religious exemptions and applying for those, which vaccines use aborted fetal cell lines. You know, all the live attenuated virus vaccines are grown in cell lines. Chickenpox vaccine uses not one but two aborted fetal cell lines for the production and development. So people need to have that information so that they can decide for themselves. If it's applying for a religious exemption, then they should know that. If they don't want aluminum, I even my dogs, they get the rabies vaccine. I want a thimerosal-free rabies vaccine. So, these are things that we should be able to decide for ourselves.
And it is raising some pretty big questions because of this transition that you seem to be advocating for, where people are more responsible for their health and the health related decisions. It goes counter to what public health tends to do. Public health just tells us that this is what you do, this is safe, don't argue. If you go against the rules, you will be punished. So, all the children who don't, if they don't have an exemption or whatever, they can't go to school if they don't, say, have the MMR. This is almost giving too much power to the people.
Well, we are a free society. At least I thought we were. That's what the great thing about the United States of America is. We have freedom. We have certain basic rights, and I would argue that all humans on the planet have certain God-given rights, and those are things that cannot be taken away. And one of those things is, what do we eat, what do we drink, what we put in our bodies. And so it's really sad to me that we have that public health has morphed into like mommy and daddy. That is not what public health was ever meant to be. Public health is supposed to come alongside, partner with the stakeholders, which is the public. And Sean and I have talked about this a lot. The role of public health is to make recommendations. It's not the law. They can guide, they can give recommendations, give information. And, health is more than just infectious diseases and vaccines. There's a lot more that goes into health. And I like to take a holistic approach when it comes to health.
Someone could argue to you, I'm sure I've asked you this question already, but I think it's important to go to it. Ebola, say, for instance. Ebola is a lethal virus. I think maybe 40-50% mortality for those who get infected. Imagine there was a very relatively safe, so to speak, effective vaccine that was sterilizing, so it prevented transmission from person to person. And you are in a situation where lots of people are spreading Ebola around. Do you, if I put you in charge of public health, do you force people to take it?
Well, my job as a public health professional is never to force or coerce or bribe or threaten somebody into doing anything. That is not my role as a public health professional. Now, you bring up a good point, though, with Ebola. So what I would advocate for is if it's a disease that's not very common, that we're not routinely exposed to, like Ebola, and the risk of risk versus benefit, the risk of the outcome of the disease is highly fatal, then I would highly encourage people, let's look at the risk of the disease versus the risk and outcome of getting a vaccine. So like in that situation, as I told the group yesterday too, is like we don't get yellow fever vaccine, but if you're going to an area where there's yellow fever, then it's recommended you get a yellow fever vaccine, right? Because it's not something we're commonly exposed to here in the US. It's not something we have here in the US. But if it's so I think that in those cases, that's where vaccines can be very helpful and very useful.
When the COVID pandemic occurred, the propaganda machine was on overdrive. Everybody, even today, a large percentage of the population still believes if somebody gets COVID, they're going to die. It was ramped up that much, and the vaccine would save you, and it would stop you spreading the disease. Now, this is what was promoted. Forget whether or not it was accurate. Based on what you said, should it therefore have been mandated?
Again, as a public health professional, we can make recommendations, and when we can provide guidance. But in terms of SARS, I never it's hard to put my experience aside, because I didn't think that it was very as serious as they were making it out to be, even from the beginning. So, we had experience with SARS, the original, in 2002 and 2003. So mandating things, requiring things, threatening people, coercing people, that's not public health. That's not public health. And if somebody tells you what to do, that's called control. That's control. They don't care about you.
Wow, powerful, powerful words. Okay, let's look at another piece that you described in the article with regards to the biological response profile. Other things that people should check for: the inflammatory response, immune dysregulation, the neurological impact, mitochondrial stress. I mean, based on this kind of studying, you would make it not cost effective to make a vaccine.
I don't know how to answer that. I don't know why we wouldn't want things to be so stringently tested. These testing for these biomarkers is routinely done in a clinical laboratories, in a clinical setting. I just had blood work done. Just go get your blood drawn. They send you the results. So what these markers are, it's not anything out of the ordinary. And again, this, in this article I wrote, is just a proposed framework. So this is a starting point. Let's start the discussion. Let's talk about this. What are going to be the most useful things to look at in determining a vaccine toxicity index?
I think that my view, certainly, I have the pragmatic view. So say, for instance, I'm going to pull it back to COVID, because that's where a lot of my understanding and the science is. And there is a very strong push from some parts of the population that all COVID vaccines should be taken off the market, shouldn't be accessible to anybody at all. And my pragmatic perspective is that if you do that, because they are not actively seeking alternatives, it means you're giving people absolutely nothing. And because I know that even the IgG4, which does have potential longer term consequences, but in the context of cytokine immune mediated responses, IgG4 actually could be protective. And so if you're not doing anything else, and you're not giving people any of the useful potential strategies out there, are you better doing something rather than nothing? That's my pragmatic view. Thoughts?
I think your point is well taken. I'm going to say something, warning, controversial. mRNA, they were not vaccines. They're not vaccines. They don't prevent infection. They never were meant to prevent infection. Again, we've had this discussion for many years now, and they were using them more as a therapeutic. What they were treating, I'm not really sure. But I think your point is very important. And as I said about the DTaP, it's time to reevaluate and reassess. And we've gotten ourselves into a situation, I think you're spot on, is that we've never been in before. By pushing these injections on people, and by skewing the immune response, and the damage that's being done to the immune system, is something we need to reevaluate. And I think you're absolutely correct, is that we need to offer some alternatives in terms of therapies, rather than pulling the only thing that's out there that could be serving to mitigate those things. And I think the IgG4 issue is very important in that.
One of the interesting things that I observed when I had come across a challenge from someone recently was that they highlighted, say, for instance, with COVID vaccines in children, and they showed something that I found very, very interesting. And I'd like your thought generally on it, which is that in the early part of the pandemic, children were at exceptionally low risk.
Mhm.
But as the pandemic went on into 21, 22, even though we had a less virulent variant with Omicron, more children were getting sick. And so then I started to wonder whether or not the mass vaccination at a population level could, in theory, have therefore made children who were at very low risk initially at much higher risk going down the line. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so this is something that I've often wondered, and would love to have a chat with Garrett about this, because I think this is what he's talked about is, the immune suppression from these injections, and we've damaged to the immune system, dampened the immune system, has changed the immune landscape, not just for humans but also in animals. So we see all kinds of things happening now, even in different animal populations. I wrote an article about this avian H5N1 in vultures, turkey vultures here in the local park, and I was like, that doesn't make any sense to me because they eat dead things. Like they probably have like a most robust immune system because they're eating things that are dead and rotting. And so like, how are they now finding avian flu in these birds that they've never seen before? So I think that again, we found ourselves in the situation we've never been in before, and we went down this road without thinking about the consequences. So what are the consequences, and how has this affected our immune system, and not just individually but as a whole, as a population? And these are they not even immune competent anymore when we think about innate immunity? And so that I think is one of the main reasons why we need to take a look at the childhood vaccination schedule, and what is the overall impact on our immune systems and on health in general when we're doing these things, and how is it reprogramming the immune system and changing the immune landscape?
When we look at the conclusion here that you had in your article, as you said, when it comes to vaccines, the public conversation often stops at a simple phrase: safe and effective. Different ingredients have different biological impacts. Reactions can vary by age, genetics, health status, and prior exposures. And without acknowledging these differences, safe can mean very different things for different people.
Yes.
You are almost suggesting a whole rewrite of the way that we approach vaccination schedules, certainly in the USA and across the world. Expand.
Yeah, so the idea from this came from actually my time in public health. So when we would have a foodborne illness, you would think about we would send the food safety branch out, and they'd go to this restaurant, do an inspection, and they have scoring sheets. So there are a lot of different things that they would look at in terms of like food handling and sanitation and food storage, and were there any violations, and they score them, right? So it's on 100%, 90%, 80%. So I thought about, what if we use this like scoring system for vaccines, right? So there are different, and again, this is just a proposed framework, but these are just ideas or categories that we can use to look at and assess vaccines and give it a score. And, for me, as I'm a logical person, if somebody says safe, what does that even mean? If somebody gives me a number, quantify it, that makes a whole lot more sense to me. So it was like, what if we score vaccines, right? And so there's an example of in the article about the hypothetical scoring system that we can use. So if it comes out 0 to 20, low toxicity. So if you go to the doctor and say, oh, we want you to get an MMR vaccine, well, what is the toxicity index? What does that look like? I think a lot of people can relate a little bit more to numbers than just safe.
And so in this here, you're saying, for example, the chemical ingredient toxicity would be 30%. What does the 30% mean here?
So again, this is just a proposed framework. This is just, what could be the most toxic thing in the vaccine. That would be, of course, the ingredients. So if you look at the ingredients and what they do, how they act and interact in the body. So I figured that we weight that the most. It's just a hypothetical breakdown of the categories to look at in scoring vaccines.
So, a practical point then, many patients just want to be told what to do. When they come to me and they have got high blood pressure, they want me to just give them the best drugs for their hypertension and say, you need to take this, unless they have a specific issue. They're allergic to calcium channel blockers or something, if they know that, or if they've had this. So they want to know this is what you need to do. They take the prescription, they walk out of there, they don't worry about it. Imagine them now coming with these kinds of questions. Who are they going to talk to? Because the system has no time to accommodate these kinds of questions.
Well, that's actually inaccurate, because as a medical professional, your job, your role is to understand your patient, right? You're supposed to talk to them, you're supposed to understand them, and you're supposed to answer all their questions. That's the whole basis of informed consent. And
I agree. Yes, go ahead, go on.
right. So it's unethical. It's just completely unethical to just push drugs on people and push them out the door. And I'm actually partnering with a nurse right now, Nurse Jody O'Malley, who has put together an ethics course for nurses. So, I think it's amazing and just fantastic what she's doing, because that is a huge part of nursing, is advocating for the patient and being that one who stands there and answers those questions. And so, it may seem bothersome, but that's your job.
Yeah, I think that what you are saying, it's an interesting time that you are saying this kind of thing, because I had just liked an article from Eric Topol talking about the potential with AI chatbots. And I know you don't like the AI thing, but don't worry, just work with me here. Just work with me here. The point being that when you are interacting with a patient, if the patient has a good understanding about what they are talking about, so for instance, hypertension, let's use that example. Imagine if they know all the, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Imagine if they know all the drugs and they know what they want to do. This is something that they can then have a much more detailed discussion with you on. Any thoughts on that? They're better educated, better informed.
Right. Well, I mean, there are responsibilities of the doctor. There's also responsibilities as the patient, and it is our responsibility to do our homework. And if a doctor says take this drug, they all come with a package insert. They all come with a package insert, and that's not there on accident. It's there for a reason, and it's there for our edification. So we need to read those things. We need to understand what it is that we're taking and why we're taking it and what the effects are and what the possible side effects are, and ask those questions, get clarification, so there are responsibilities on both sides of the table.
There we go. I disappeared for a second. So thank you for keeping what's happening. I'm being targeted for this conversation, it seems. But
it's my fault. Sorry. Not sorry.
So yeah, so yeah,
I think this is an important discussion, though. It's an important question because, over the last 5 years, the topic of vaccines has become so divisive, and people don't know where to get credible information, and they don't know who to ask, and it's people have been shamed and they've been censored and silenced, and that's not effective. It's not effective, and it's we need to be having this conversation. We need to have these open, honest discussions, because people need to know they are allowed to ask questions. They are
Yeah.
allowed to ask for information. It's a legal and ethical responsibility of medical providers to give that information.
Yeah, I think we are shifting into a new phase of medicine and science. And as we come into this phase, more and more responsibility will be passed on to the public to know what they're doing, why they're doing it, to come with their questions and to have their questions openly and honestly addressed, and any concerns. There will be much less force for people to do things. But with that comes that responsibility that if things go wrong, they have to accept these consequences. That's another part that able to blame someone else for that sense of accountability. So as we close out here, Jennifer, I want you to tie this together, and I want you to tell us a little bit more about that ethical course that you're building. I think that's very, very important.
Well, overall, I think when we talk about vaccines, that toxicity, yes, it is very complex and it's a complex topic, but no medical intervention is risk free. So it's very important that we have the information, and this is what informed consent is all about: is having clear communication and informed consent to help identify potential issues and allowing people to make choices based on their age, risk, and their health status, as well as I think that this kind of thing can actually help rebuild trust and transparency with public health and the public.
Excellent. And as I said, I do appreciate you, Jennifer, because you're one of the people who I know is not afraid to call it out, meaning that you stood up. It's important for people to remember. She stood up for patients. You lost your job because of that. You almost got blacklisted because of your stance. We need people like you to give honest, direct advice and hopefully rebuild the trust that has been so decimated over the past 5 years.
Right. I mean, I've tried to be a voice of reason and take a common sense approach. Let's take a step back. Let's ask some questions. Let's think through this and come to some conclusion and help people come to a conclusion for themselves.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jennifer. Look forward to talking to you again in the near future. Thank you, everyone who have been with us. And look out for her post, Smith's Virology blog. Join her on Substack and have a great evening. If you don't mind, Jennifer, if you just stay with me for the
Okay.
outro.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Philip, for letting me talk about this topic.
Okay.